The dress was the first lie. Nellie had sewn 3 of the 12 pearl buttons herself, sitting by the narrow window of her childhood room while her stepmother watched with the expression of someone counting coins. The pearls were real. The love behind them was not. She would only understand that later, when the smell of smoke and betrayal had already soaked into everything she thought she knew. But on the morning of her 23rd birthday, she did not know yet. She stood at the edge of the great hall in Ashford Manor, her fingers laced together at her waist, her dark hair pinned in a style that had taken the housemaid nearly an hour to complete. The hall smelled of beeswax candles and dried lavender, of the cold stone walls and the faint, sweet decay of flowers left in vases 2 days too long. It was her birthday, and also, allegedly, the day her future would be settled. Her stepmother, Countess Vera, had said those exact words at breakfast. "Your future will be settled today, Nellie. Behave accordingly." Nellie had nodded and eaten her bread without butter, because Vera considered butter excessive for girls who needed to stay presentable. The man she was to meet was called Dorian Ashwell, a beta from a respectable pack in the Northern Territories, educated, mannered, selected by Vera, with the same methodical coldness she applied to selecting horses. He was suitable. That was the word Vera used. Suitable, as though Nellie were a document requiring the correct signature. She had never met him before that morning. He arrived in a dark traveling coat, tall and fine-featured, with pale eyes that moved across the room in quick, assessing sweeps. When those eyes landed on Nellie, something in his expression arranged itself into warmth, the way a man adjusts his collar before entering a formal room, practiced, intentional. She noticed it, but told herself she was being uncharitable. He kissed her hand. He said she was lovelier than described. He said the word described without realizing it betrayed that a description had already been traded between him and Vera before Nellie had ever been consulted. The conversation lasted 2 hours. He was pleasant. He laughed at the right moments. He asked about her interests with the focus of someone checking items from a list. Nellie answered carefully and watched his hands. She had always watched hands. Her father, before he died, had told her that a person's hands told the truth their mouths refused. Dorian's hands, she noticed, were still when he spoke to her, and restless when he spoke to Vera. When he addressed her stepmother, his fingers moved against his knee in a pattern too rhythmic to be nervous. It looked like counting, like a man tallying something. She filed this away and said nothing. By the end of the afternoon, Vera announced, in the tone of someone reporting weather, that the match had been confirmed. There would be a formal agreement within a fortnight. Nellie would relocate to the Ashwell territory after the autumn equinox. Dorian shook Vera's hand with the grip of a business partner. He kissed Nellie's cheek with the warmth of a man performing a role he had rehearsed. That night, she could not sleep. The manor was old and full of sounds after dark, the groan of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the stone, the distant call of an owl in the pines that bordered the eastern wall. Nellie lay on top of her covers in her nightgown, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting over her sternum where a heaviness had settled that she could not name. She told herself it was nerves, normal nerves. Any woman would feel this before a formal agreement. She told herself that suitable was not a terrible thing to be, that warmth could grow from steadiness, that perhaps she was asking for something the world had never promised her. She nearly believed it. At some point before midnight, she rose to get water from the pitcher on the washstand, and it was the thirst that saved her. Or perhaps it was her father, working through ordinary need to place her exactly where she needed to be, because as she passed the top of the stairs, she heard voices below. The library doors were not fully closed. A blade of amber light fell across the stone floor of the corridor. Vera's voice first, low and precise, with the clipped certainty of someone who had planned carefully and intended to be understood. Then Dorian's, quieter, carrying the flattened affect of a man speaking to a collaborator, rather than a woman he was courting. Nellie did not move. "The agreement must be signed before she sees the territorial records," Vera was saying. "Once the marriage is formalized, the Ashford lands transfer under pack law. There is nothing she can do after that." "And the brother?" Dorian asked. A pause. Nellie's grip tightened on the banister. The wood was cold under her fingers. Owen is not a concern. He is 3 territories away and has no legal standing unless she petitions the council, which she will not do because she will not know to. You are certain she suspects nothing? Nellie, Vera said. And the way she said the name was the most honest thing Nellie had ever heard from that woman, because it contained no warmth whatsoever. Sees what she is shown. She is not stupid, but she is trusting. And that is the same as stupid in a world like this. The water pitcher was still in Nellie's hand. She did not remember picking it up. She became aware of it only because her knuckles had gone white. The lands. Her father's lands. The Ashford territory, which her father had built and loved and left, not to Vera, but to Nellie and Owen, in a document that Vera had managed to have reinterpreted after his death by a council she had charmed and pressured over years. All of it. The forests her father had walked with her as a child. The streams, the stone walls, the pack rights embedded in generations of her bloodline. They were going to take it. Dorian was not a suitor. He was a mechanism. She was not a bride. She was a transfer. The realization did not arrive the way she might have imagined, in a hot wave of fury or a collapse of breath. It arrived slowly, the way cold does, seeping in through every small gap until the whole body understands that the air has changed and warmth is no longer a given. She set the pitcher down on the step without a sound. She turned and walked back to her room. She moved with the controlled stillness of someone whose mind has gone ahead of her body, already calculating, already sorting. She dressed in the dark wool skirt, dark blouse, her heavier boots, the ones with the worn left heel that she had meaning to repair for months, her traveling cloak, the small carved box her father had given her, which contained his signet ring, and the folded copy of the original land deed that she had kept for reasons she had never been able to explain to herself. Now she could explain it. She took the servants' staircase, which led out near the stables, and she did not look back at the room she had slept in for 23 years. The night air hit her like a hand pressed flat against her face, cold, sharp, smelling of pine resin and distant rain, of horses and straw and iron-cold stone. The stables were quiet. She saddled the smaller gray herself, the one the grooms called Mist, moving quickly through the motions her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand that some lessons are given, because a parent suspects the world will not always be safe. She led the horse to the edge of the tree line before mounting, so the sound of hooves on the courtyard stone wouldn't carry back to the house. The forest swallowed her. She rode without a destination, because a destination required knowing which roads were still safe, which pack territories she could cross without permission, and who in this world she could trust. The answers to those questions were fewer than she had believed yesterday, and the shock of that reduction was still working its way through her. Owen. She had to reach Owen, 3 territories away, Vera had said, and no legal standing unless she petitions the council, which meant a petition was exactly what Nellie intended to file, the moment she found her brother and placed her father's signet ring in his hands. The rain began before she had been riding an hour, not the gentle kind, the kind that means business, that comes in from the northern ranges carrying cold and decision. It plastered her cloak to her shoulders and turned the forest path to a soft dark ribbon that reflected nothing. Mist was steady, bless her. Nellie kept her head down and her eyes forward, and she did not allow herself to cry, because grief was for when she was safe. And she was not safe yet, and she did not know when she would be. She did not know that the forest she was riding into was not empty. She did not know that the rain had also driven something else to the edge of the trees, something enormous, something that had been traveling for 3 days and had chosen this forest path for reasons it could not have explained in words. She did not know that the sound of a single horse moving through the dark had already been heard. She only knew the rain, and the cold, and the smell of pine, and the small weight of her father's ring pressing through the fabric of her cloak against her ribs. It was enough. It had to be enough. She rode on. The horse stopped before Nellie did. Mist pulled up short with a sound low in her throat. Not a whinny, but something closer to a warning, the kind of sound prey animals make when the body understands danger before the mind has caught up. Nellie felt it through the reins, through the shift in the mare's weight, and she tightened her legs instinctively and scanned the dark ahead. The rain had thinned to a cold mist that blurred the tree line into shapes without definition. The path had narrowed here, pressed on both sides by old-growth pines whose roots surfaced through the soil like fingers. There were no torches, No sound of travelers, no hoofbeats, no voice. Just the drip of water from branches overhead and the particular silence that forests make when everything inside them has gone still at once. Then she saw the wolves, 3 of them, at the edge of the path ahead. Large, pale-furred, with eyes that caught what little light existed and held it. They were not moving. They were simply there, in the way that a wall is simply there, placed without apology across the only way forward. Their posture was not the low, coiled readiness of animals hunting. It was something more deliberate, organized, like soldiers who had been told to wait. Nellie's breath came out slow and controlled, because panic would travel down the reins and into the mare, and that she could not afford. She had grown up in a shifter world. She knew what wolves looked like when they were animals, and what they looked like when they were something more. These were the second kind. She pulled Mist to a halt and sat very still. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the largest of the 3, the one at the center, turned its head toward the trees to the right of the path, and in the way that communication moves through a pack without words, the other 2 stepped aside. Not fled. Stepped. Deliberately. Creating a space on the path that had not existed a moment ago. Through the gap they made, a man walked out of the trees. He was not rushing. He moved through the undergrowth and onto the path, with the unhurried quality of someone for whom urgency is a choice rather than a reflex, and who has not yet chosen it. He was large in the way that carries no performance, broad through the shoulder, wearing a dark riding coat that had seen weather and not apologized for it. His hair was dark, rain-damp, pushed back from a face that was all hard geometry and controlled expression. He carried no visible weapon, which, in Nellie's experience, was either the sign of a fool or of someone who had not needed one in long enough that the habit had faded. He did not look like a fool. He stopped at a distance she could measure, far enough to be deliberate, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. They were gray, the color of riverstone, and they were doing what she recognized as a very thorough assessment without moving in any visible way. "You are riding alone," he said. Not a question. His voice was low, even, carrying easily through the rain without effort. "I am," Nellie said, "in the middle of the night, through Vale territory." She had not known this was Vale territory. She had been riding without a map, following the path that led north, and that was a significant error she was now recalculating. The Vale pack was not hostile, from what she knew, but they were sovereign, and crossing their lands without permission was the kind of mistake that ended badly. "I did not intend to intrude," she said carefully. "I am trying to reach the Northern Road." The Northern Road is another 4 hours east. He glanced at Mist, briefly, then back at Nellie. "You are bleeding." She was not aware that she was. She looked down and saw that at some point during the ride, the branch she had ridden through had caught her forearm, and the dark wool of her sleeve was darker still, near the wrist. It did not hurt. It would. She said nothing. He studied her for a moment, with the patience of someone who has learned that silence pulls more truth from people than questions do. "Where are you going?" he asked. "That is my own business," she said, and heard the sharpness in her own voice and did not soften it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. A recognition, perhaps, the particular look of a man who has encountered resistance and found it more interesting than compliance. "It is," he agreed, "but you are in my territory, on a night with no moon, with a wound you haven't noticed, and a horse who is 3 hours from exhaustion. So your business has become, briefly, relevant to mine." Nellie's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue. She had the argument fully formed and ready. But Mist chose that moment to drop her head with a heaviness that communicated, without ambiguity, that the mare agreed with the stranger. "I do not need assistance," Nellie said. "That," he said, "is almost certainly untrue." He was not unkind when he said it. That was the part that was hardest to dismiss. There was no condescension in his voice, no performance of patience designed to manage her. He said it the way someone states a fact they find neither satisfying nor troubling, just true. She gripped the reins and looked at the path ahead, at the wolves who had stepped aside and were still watching with their steady, lantern-colored eyes, and she calculated what she had. A tired horse, a bleeding arm, an unknown forest, no map, no ally. And behind her, a manor where two people were planning to dismantle everything her father had built. She looked back at the man. "Who are you?" she asked. A pause, brief but present. "Xander," he said, just the name. No title, no pack, no designation. She would learn later that this was characteristic, that he introduced himself the same way to the lowest stable hand as to visiting lords, and that people who knew who he was found it quietly unsettling, and people who didn't found out soon enough. "Nellie," she said, because it would have been absurd not to. He nodded once, as though that was sufficient. Then he turned slightly and said something she couldn't fully catch to the wolves, and two of them vanished back into the trees. The third remained, sitting at the edge of the path with the composed authority of a dog who has been asked to wait and intends to. "There is a lodge 1/2 a mile east," Xander said, turning back to her. "Dry, warm, with a physician who is already awake because he keeps strange hours. You can rest until morning, and then tell me whether you still want to find the northern road alone. I did not agree to go anywhere with you." "No," he said. "You didn't." He waited. He did not press. He did not offer his hand or step toward her horse, or indicate in any way that refusal was unwelcome. He simply waited, with the posture of a man who has enough patience to outlast most situations and knows it. Nellie hated that she found it steadying. She hated more that he was right about Mist. 1/2 a mile, she said finally. 1/2 a mile, he confirmed. She followed him through the trees, and she kept 3 horse lengths between herself and his back, and she watched the way the remaining wolf tracked alongside them without being told to, and she thought about her father's ring pressing against her ribs and Owen, 3 territories away, and the land deed folded inside the carved box strapped to her pack. The lodge appeared through the pines like something from a different world. Stone and timber, low-roofed, with firelight visible in 2 of the windows, and a stable attached to the eastern side that smelled of clean straw and horses recently fed. There were guards at the entrance, 2 men who straightened at Xander's approach with a sharpness that confirmed, in a single motion, what she had already begun to suspect about who exactly he was. Not just a man who owned forest land, not just a man traveling through. The way the guards looked at him was the way people look at someone who holds something real, not borrowed status, not inherited title, but actual authority, the kind that comes from being the person that other capable people defer to without resentment. She dismounted without assistance, and handed Mist to the stable boy, who appeared immediately. And she made a note of how the horse was handled, because how an animal is treated tells you something about the household that keeps it. The boy was gentle. Mist relaxed within 30 seconds. Inside the lodge, the fire was built high, and the air smelled of pine resin and something herbal she couldn't name. And a small man with round spectacles, and the focused expression of someone interrupted in the middle of important work, looked up from a table covered in papers and did not seem surprised to see her. "Arm," Xander said. The physician was already moving. Nellie sat in the chair closest to the fire because she was colder than she had allowed herself to notice, and she submitted to the physician's attention on her arm with the controlled stillness of someone conserving energy for what comes next. Xander stood near the window. He did not hover. He did not make conversation. He watched the room the way a man watches a room he is responsible for, alert and still, his arms loose at his sides, his gray eyes moving periodically to her with the even attention of someone who has taken on a task and intends to complete it. She had not asked him to take on any task. She was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, where honest things lived, that this bothered her less than it should. The physician bandaged her arm, declared it superficial, offered her a tin cup of something that smelled of dried herbs and honey, and then returned to his papers with the efficiency of a man who has decided his role is complete. The fire crackled. The rain hit the window. "You are running from something," Xander said. Still near the window, not looking at her now, looking out at the dark. "Or toward something," Nellie said. He considered that. "Both, probably," he said. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms and into her arms, and she did not answer, because he was right, and she was not yet ready to explain to a stranger in a forest lodge the full dimensions of what had happened tonight. or how completely the ground had moved beneath her, or how frightened she was, under the stillness, of what came next. But she was alive. She was warm. Her horse was safe. It was, again, enough. For now. She woke before dawn to the sound of voices. Not the alarming kind, low, measured, the cadence of men discussing logistics rather than threats. But Nellie was not yet in a place where the absence of immediate danger translated into rest, and her eyes opened fully before she had completed the thought of opening them. She was on the narrow cot near the fire, covered with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and had been placed over her at some point while she slept. She did not remember lying down. She remembered the tin cup, the warmth, the physician's lamp guttering low, and then nothing. Her body had made the decision her mind had refused to. The carved box was still strapped against her side, beneath the cloak she had used as an additional cover. She checked it before she checked anything else. Still there. Ring, deed, everything. She sat up slowly and assessed the room. The physician was gone. The fire had been banked to coals. The gray morning light came through the window in flat, colorless sheets, and through the door, which was slightly ajar, she could hear Xander's voice and another she didn't recognize, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who work together closely enough to have developed their own economy of words. She stood, straightened her clothes, ran her fingers through her hair with the grim practicality of someone who has accepted that appearances are secondary to function, and pushed the door open. The main room of the lodge was larger than she'd registered the night before. A long table dominated the center, covered now with maps weighted at the corners by iron candle holders. Xander stood at one end with two men she hadn't seen before, both large, both carrying the particular stillness of trained fighters at rest. One had a scar along his jaw. The other was younger, with the alert eyes of someone who processes everything and reveals nothing. All three looked up when she entered. Xander's expression did not change. The other two did the thing men do when they are trying not to look surprised and are not entirely succeeding. "There is bread and cold meat on the sideboard," Xander said. "And water has been heated if you want a wash." She had not expected that, the specificity of it, the quiet, practical care embedded in the information. She nodded and moved to the sideboard, because she was hungry, and because standing in the doorway was not a position she intended to hold for long. She ate standing, with her back to the wall where she could see the room, and she listened to the conversation at the table without pretending not to. They were discussing border movement. A pack called the Reth had been pushing west along the Vale boundary for 3 weeks, testing patrols, pulling back before contact, the pattern of an organization feeling out a perimeter before committing to something larger. Xander spoke about it with the focused brevity of someone for whom this kind of problem is a familiar language, noting gaps, asking questions, redirecting when one of the men began speculating beyond the available evidence. He was, she realized, not simply a man who owned land in Vael territory. He was the reason Vael territory had a boundary worth discussing. The scarred man said something about a petition from 3 smaller packs requesting formal alliance, and Xander said they would discuss it at the council meeting in 4 days, and the younger man made a note on a separate piece of paper, and Nellie understood, with the quiet certainty of someone assembling a picture from its edges inward, exactly who was standing at that table. Alpha King. The title sat in her mind with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. She set down her bread. He had not told her. He had given her his name and nothing else, and she had followed him into a forest lodge and slept under his blanket and eaten his bread, and she had not known, and she felt, suddenly, and unreasonably, at a disadvantage in a way that the cold and the wound and the night had not managed to produce. As if he heard the silence change, Xander looked across the room at her. She met his eyes steadily, because she would not give him the satisfaction of looking away, and she said, "You didn't tell me who you were." The 2 men at the table found reasons to study the maps with great concentration. "You didn't ask," Xander said. "I asked your name. I gave it. You gave half of it." Something moved in his expression, subtle, contained. Not quite an apology, but its cousin. "Would you have come with me if I had told you the rest?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Then I gave you what you needed to make a safe decision," he said. and kept what would have made you make an unsafe one. It was infuriating logic. She recognized it as such while also recognizing, with equal reluctance, that he was not wrong. She would not have followed a king into a forest in the middle of the night. She would have ridden mist into the ground trying to avoid it. She picked up her bread again and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He dismissed the two men with a word shortly after, and the room settled into the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who are both thinking carefully about what to say next. Xander moved to the other end of the sideboard, poured water into a cup, and stood with the same unhurried ease he seemed to carry everywhere, as though the space he occupied had simply agreed to accommodate him. "Tell me where you are going," he said. "Not because I require it. Because I may be able to help. Why would you help me? Because you rode alone through my territory in the middle of the night, rather than stay wherever you came from," he said. "And in my experience, that kind of decision is not made lightly." She looked at him for a long moment. At the gray eyes and the steady posture, and the hands that were still, the way her father had taught her to watch for, the way Dorian's had not been. She told him, not everything, not yet, but the shape of it, the land, the marriage agreement, Vera's voice through the library door, the word suitable, and everything it had been designed to conceal. She told it in the flat, factual tone of someone who has not yet given themselves permission to be angry, and she watched his face while she spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not offer expressions of sympathy that would have felt like performances. He listened the way someone listens when they are actually processing, when the information is being arranged into something useful, rather than simply received. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Ashford Lands," he said. "Your father was Edmund Ashford." It was not a question. She stiffened slightly. "You knew him?" "Of him. He petitioned the High Council 12 years ago to have his Pax territory formally registered under dual heir law. It was granted." He paused. "Which means what Vera has done is not only a betrayal, it is illegal under High Council authority." The word illegal landed somewhere in her chest and opened a door she hadn't known was there. "Can it be challenged?" "With the original deed and the signet ring of the registered heir," he said. "Yes, before the marriage agreement is formalized. After that, it becomes significantly more complicated." She pulled the carved box from beneath her cloak and set it on the sideboard between them. She opened it. The ring caught the gray morning light and held it. Xander looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he looked at her. "How long before the agreement is signed?" "Vera said a fortnight, but if she suspects I've gone," Nellie said, "she'll move faster." "Then we move faster." He said it simply, as a fact, and the "we" landed in the conversation before she had consented to it. "I have not asked for your involvement," she said. "No," he said, "you haven't." He waited again. That same quality of patience she had encountered the night before, open rather than pressuring, leaving the space for her to fill or not. She thought about Owen, 3 territories north, who did not know his inheritance was being signed away. She thought about the land deed and the ring and the council chamber she had never entered and would need to navigate alone. She thought about Vera's voice, flat and certain. She sees what she is shown. "What would your involvement look like?" she asked. "Transport to the High Council seat," he said. "Legal standing. A formal escort that prevents anyone from turning you away at the door. And someone who knows how the council chamber works, because it is not a place that rewards the unprepared." "And what do you want in return?" He met her eyes. "Nothing that you are not willing to give." She held his gaze and looked for the lie in it, the way she had been looking for lies in faces for 23 years and had apparently, catastrophically, been looking in the wrong places. She found nothing, which meant either he was telling the truth or he was better at concealing it than anyone she had ever met. She was aware that those were not the same thing, but she was also aware that she had run out of roads. "There is my brother," she said. "Owen. He needs to know what is happening." "Where is he?" "Veldrin. Northern Territory, Cassan Packlands." Something shifted in Xander's expression. Brief, controlled, but present. "Cassan," he repeated. "You know it?" "I know," he said carefully, "that 2 weeks ago, a man matching your brother's description was taken into Cassan custody on charges that have not been formally filed." The room went very quiet. Nellie's hand closed around the carved box. "Taken," she said. The word came out level, which cost her. "Held," he said, "not harmed as far as my information goes. But held." And there it was. The piece she had not known was missing. Not just her land, not just her future. Owen, her brother, who was 3 territories away and no legal concern, as Vera had said, with the satisfaction of someone who had already arranged that it be so. She had thought the ground moved when she heard the voices in the library. She understood now that it had not finished moving. She looked at the ring in the box, at the deed beneath it, at the man across the sideboard who was watching her absorb this with the steady attention of someone who was not going to look away. "When do we leave?" she said. They left before the mist had finished lifting from the trees. Xander's men had prepared 2 carriages and a mounted escort of 6, all of them moving with the quiet efficiency of people who do not need to be told twice, and have long since stopped needing to be told at all. Nellie watched from the lodge doorway as the horses were brought out, dark and well-fed, their breath visible in the cold morning air, and she thought about Mist, who had been stabled and watered and brushed to a shine that the mare had not seen in months. She had checked on the horse before dawn. Old habit, inherited from her father. One of the grooms had been sleeping in the stall beside her. That detail had settled somewhere in Nellie's chest and stayed there. The journey to the High Council seat at Varenhold would take 2 days by carriage, 1 if the northern road held, and they rode hard. Xander chose the middle path, steady pace, no unnecessary stops, arriving before exhaustion made anyone careless. He explained this to her as they boarded, not as a man explaining things to someone who requires management, but as one traveler informing another of the plan, leaving room for objection. She had none. She was too busy calculating. The carriage interior smelled of leather and beeswax and faintly of pine resin from the forest they were leaving. Nellie sat with the carved box in her lap and the land deed unfolded across her knees. Reading it for the 4th time as though repetition might reveal something new, it did not. What it revealed was the same thing it had always revealed, her father's signature, Owen's name beside hers, the council seal pressed in burgundy wax along the bottom edge. Dual heir registration. Xander had said it was legally binding under High Council authority. It needed to be enough. Xander rode outside for the first hour, and she was grateful for the solitude. When he finally joined her in the carriage, transferring from horseback with the efficiency of someone who had done it in worse conditions, he brought the cold air in with him and settled across from her with his coat, still damp at the shoulders, and his attention immediately on the road behind them through the rear-facing window. "Are we followed?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "Vera will have discovered you gone by now. She will need time to decide whether to pursue or accelerate the agreement." "She'll accelerate," Nellie said, without hesitation. "Pursuit draws attention. She has always preferred the kind of power that doesn't announce itself." He looked at her. "You know her well." "I know what 12 years of watching someone operate looks like," Nellie said. "She never raises her voice. She never makes threats. She simply arranges things so that the outcome she wants becomes the only available option." She paused. "She is very good at it. She miscalculated," he said. "She miscalculated me," Nellie corrected. "She thought I would stay in the room she built for me." Something in his expression shifted, the same quality of subtle recognition she had seen in the lodge that morning. He said nothing, but he did not look away, and she found that she could hold the eye contact without the defensiveness that usually accompanied it. She looked back at the deed instead. "Tell me about the council," she said. "What I need to know, not the formal version." He considered. 7 seated members, 2 are neutral by practice. They follow legal precedent and do not engage in politics if they can avoid it. 2 are aligned with the larger territorial pacts and will be influenced by whoever holds the most land adjacent to the matter being decided. He paused. 1 is Vera's. She has a council member. She has cultivated Lord Cassian Veer for 8 years. He has voted in alignment with Ashford Manor interests in every session since your father's death. The name landed with the flat recognition of a piece clicking into place. "And the remaining 2? 1 is mine," he said. "Formally independent, but my pack's relationship with the council is long-standing. She will listen to evidence. And the last? Undecided. Lord Fenwick. He is old and principled, and deeply uncomfortable with controversy. He will follow the legal argument if it is presented without theater. Then we need 3, Nellie said. The 2 neutral and Fenwick. Yes. And to get Fenwick, we need the argument to be clean, precise, he said. He responds to precision, no emotional appeal, no political framing. Document, law, precedent. She looked at the deed in her hands. I can do that. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. The carriage rolled on. The forest thinned and opened into the long gray fields of the territorial Midlands, stone walls and bare-limbed trees, and the occasional farmhouse sending smoke into the low sky. Nellie watched the landscape and let the rhythm of the wheels work through her thinking. Owen, she said, how do we get him out of Casson custody? A formal petition from a registered heir, supported by High Council authority, overrides pact detention in cases where no charges have been filed, Xander said. If we win the council session, the order for his release follows within the same decree, and if the Casson pack refuses? A pause. They will not refuse me. She heard what was underneath that sentence. Not arrogance. Certainty. The kind that comes from being the person that other packs ultimately answer to, and knowing it, and carrying that knowledge without enjoyment. You are Alpha King, she said. Not a question this time. Yes. Of all the northern territories. And several of the southern ones, he said, without inflection. She absorbed this. And you are here, in a carriage, because a woman with a bleeding arm asked about the northern road. For the first time, something genuinely warm moved across his face, not quite a smile. The shape that a smile makes in a man who has learned to hold most things back. I was already in Vale territory, he said. The patrol was routine. But you stayed. He met her eyes. You gave me reason to. She looked away first, not because she was uncomfortable, though she was, but because the alternative was continuing to hold his gaze while the warm thing in his expression did things to her composure that she could not afford. She had been in this carriage for 4 hours. She had known him for less than a day. She had just discovered that the last man she had trusted with proximity had been counting her inheritance like coins. She was not in a position to be moved by gray eyes and stillness. She was not. They stopped at midday at a way station run by a woman named Berta, who looked at Xander the way people look at weather, with respect and no particular surprise. Hot soup, bread still warm from the oven, water from a deep well that tasted of cold stone. Nellie ate with both hands wrapped around the bowl and felt, for the first time since the night before, something close to present in her own body. Berta brought a second loaf without being asked, and set it between them on the table with a look that was either approval or assessment. Possibly both. When they were back in the carriage, Nellie said, How long have you known about Vera? About what she was doing with the Ashford lands? Xander was quiet for a beat too long. She looked up from the deed. You knew. I had information, he said carefully, that suggested the Ashford estate had been mismanaged since Edmund's death. Mismanaged in directions that benefited the Countess. I did not have the specific nature of the arrangement until you told me this morning, but you knew something was wrong. Yes. And I had no legal mechanism to act without a petition from a registered heir, a request from within the Ashford pack, or a formal complaint to the council. None of those existed. He held her gaze. Until last night. She thought about that. About the way systems are built to require the very people they harm to initiate their own rescue. About how neatly Vera had understood that, and arranged accordingly. She almost won, Nellie said quietly. She almost did, he agreed. She would have if I had slept through it. You didn't. I was thirsty. Your father, he said, sounds like the kind of man who raised a daughter to notice things. Something caught in her throat. She pressed it down. He was. The afternoon passed in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected the forced conversation of two people confined together by circumstance. What she got instead was the particular ease of sitting with someone who does not require constant acknowledgement of their presence. He read from a leather-bound document she didn't ask about. She reviewed the deed until she could have recited it from memory. Outside, the midland fields gave way to the steeper terrain of the approach to Varenhold. the road climbing through stands of dark fir and across bridges of old stone. When the first lights of the city appeared through the window, faint and scattered across the hillside like embers, Nellie felt something move through her. Not hope. Not yet. Something harder than hope, and more useful. Intention. She was going to walk into that council chamber tomorrow with her father's ring on her hand and his deed in her possession, and she was going to be precise and clean and irrefutable, and Lord Fenwick was going to be very uncomfortable, and Vera's man on the council was going to discover that 8 years of cultivation was not the same as legal authority, and Owen was going to be released from a cell he should never have been in, and then she was going to figure out the rest. "Nellie," Xander said. She turned. He was looking at her with the gray eyes and the still hands and the expression she had not yet learned to fully read, and he said, "Whatever happens in there tomorrow, you are not alone in it." She held that sentence at arm's length, because she had learned very recently to be careful about comfort offered by people whose motives she hadn't fully mapped. But she also held it, because it was the first time in longer than she could clearly remember that someone had said something like that, and meant a we that wasn't about what they stood to gain. She nodded once. "I know," she said, and found, quietly, that she did. Varenhold at dawn smelled of iron and cold stone, and the particular kind of authority that accumulates in places where decisions have been made for centuries. The High Council building sat at the city's center like a fist, gray granite, 4 stories, with narrow windows that admitted light without inviting observation. The steps leading to the entrance were worn smooth by generations of boots, and the guards at the top wore the burgundy and black of council neutrality, which meant they answered to no single pack and were, theoretically, unimpressible by rank. Theoretically. When Xander came up those steps with Nellie at his side and 4 of his guard behind them, the senior guard's posture changed in the way that cannot be entirely trained out of a person who genuinely understands who they are looking at. He straightened. He stepped aside. He said nothing, because nothing was required. Nellie noted this and kept walking. She had slept at a council-adjacent lodge the night before, in a room that was plain and clean, with a fire that someone had built high before she arrived, and a basin of warm water and fresh linen on the chair. She had washed her face and her hands and the wound on her arm, which the physician had dressed well, and which had stiffened overnight but was manageable. She had sat on the edge of the bed for an hour, not sleeping, organizing. Then she had slept for 4 hours with the carved box under her pillow and risen before the bells. She wore the same dark wool. It was clean enough. She had pinned her hair herself, simply, without the hour-long architecture of the day before. She looked like what she was, a woman who had ridden through a night forest and come out the other side with her father's ring and her own intention, and had not had time to be anything more decorative than that. Xander had looked at her when she came down to the entrance hall, a look that took in the whole of her without commentary, and said only, "Ready?" "Yes," she had said. The council chamber was long and high-ceilinged, with dark wood paneling and 7 seats arranged in a curved formation at the far end, elevated on a dais by 3 steps. Before the dais was a table for presenting parties, plain, no chairs, designed to keep petitioners standing. Designed, Nellie understood, to make standing feel like a concession. She stood anyway, her father's ring on her right hand, the deed and a formal letter of legal standing signed by Xander in her left, and she waited for the 7 members to settle. She found Vera's man immediately. Lord Cassian Vere was perhaps 60, with the expensive preserved quality of someone who has never been cold or hungry, and the careful arrangement of his expression into professional neutrality that is itself a form of tell. He looked at the documents she carried without looking at her, which was a choice. She noted it. The 2 neutral members were, as Xander had described, attentive. Unreadable in the comfortable way of people who genuinely intend to follow evidence. Lord Fenwick, at the far left, was old and precise-looking, with spectacles on a chain and a quill already in his hand before the session was formally opened. The posture of a man who processes the world by writing it down. Xander sat to her left, not at the petitioner's table, but in the first row of the observers' gallery, close enough to be present. He had insisted she lead the petition herself. "The council will listen to the heir," he had said the night before. Not to me presenting on her behalf. Your voice. Your evidence. I am here if they require corroborating authority. She had understood. He was giving her the room. She presented the case in exactly the way she had assembled it over 2 days in a carriage. She did not raise her voice. She did not make emotional appeals. She laid the original land deed on the table, walked the council through the dual heir registration point by point, cited the specific council statute under which it had been granted, presented the evidence of the marriage agreement between Vera and Dorian Ashwell as a mechanism designed to transfer registered packland through spousal acquisition, which was prohibited under the same statute, and named Owen's detention in Casson territory as a coordinated effort to remove the second registered heir from legal reach before the agreement could be contested. Precise, clean, irrefutable. Lord Fenwick had filled 2 pages of notes before she was halfway through. She counted this as a good sign. Vera attempted an objection at the midpoint, citing the reinterpreted estate documents that Vera had filed after her father's death. Nellie had anticipated this. She produced the original filing record from the High Council's own archive, which Xander's legal attaché had retrieved at first light that morning, showing that the reinterpretation had been submitted by a council representative, Vere himself, on behalf of a petitioning party who was listed only as a concerned member of the Ashford household. The chamber went very quiet. Fenwick stopped writing and looked at Vere over his spectacles. Vere said nothing. His hands, Nellie noticed, were very still in the way that is not steadiness, but its opposite. The stillness of a man who has stopped moving because movement will give him away. The session lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, the council voted 4-2, with Vere abstaining in the particular way that means a man has calculated that a vote against is more damaging than no vote at all. The 2 neutral members voted with Fenwick and Xander's representative. The dual heir registration was upheld. The Ashwell marriage agreement was declared void under Pack law. The Ashford estate and territorial rights were confirmed in the names of Nellie and Owen Ashford, the registered heirs of Edmund Ashford, in full. A separate order was issued for Owen's immediate release from Casson custody. Nellie stood at the table and listened to the formal reading of the decree and felt the ground, which had been moving under her for 3 days, go still. Not the false stillness of before. Not the stillness of someone standing on something that is secretly hollow. The stillness of actual ground. Solid, old, real. Her father's ring was warm on her hand. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in that room, and she kept the promise. But it was close, and she was aware of how close it was, and she was grateful for the formality of the chamber that gave her something to hold her face around. When she turned from the table, Xander was standing at the edge of the gallery. He had moved without her noticing, the way large, quiet things sometimes do. He was looking at her with the gray eyes and the expression she had been learning over 2 days. And she understood now what it contained. Not triumph, not satisfaction at a strategy executed. Something more direct than that, something that was simply about her, the specific her who had ridden through a night forest with a bleeding arm and a dead man's ring and faced a council chamber and spoken clearly and won. She walked toward him, and he met her halfway, and she said, "Owen." Because that was the first thing, always. "The release order was dispatched an hour ago," he said. "He will be in Varenhold by tomorrow evening." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. "Thank you." "You did this," he said. "I provided the carriage. You provided considerably more than the carriage. Nellie." She looked at him. "You did this," he said again. And the simplicity of it, the refusal to diminish her by sharing the credit he didn't need, undid something in her chest that she had been holding very tightly for a very long time. Owen arrived the following evening, as promised. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a tiredness around his eyes that had not been there before. But he was whole. And when he saw her in the entrance hall of the lodge, he stopped walking and stared at her for a moment, as though he was checking that she was real. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and she held on to him with both arms, and felt, for the first time since the night she had heard Vera's voice through the library door, that she was not the only person in the world who knew the truth of what their family had been and what had been done to it. She told him everything. He listened with the focused, contained expression of a man assembling his grief into something he can use, which was so entirely their father's face that it stopped her voice twice. He asked precise questions. He did not waste time on disbelief. When she finished, he looked at the ring on her hand, then at her. "You rode out alone," he said. "I had to." "You rode out alone," he said again, "through Vielle territory, in the middle of the night, and ended up in front of the High Council inside of 3 days. I had help," she said. Owen looked across the room to where Xander stood near the window, speaking with his legal attaché, then back at her. His expression did something complicated. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." He almost smiled. "I was going to say thank you to him." "Oh," she said, "that's fine then." In the weeks that followed, Vera and Dorian Ashwell faced formal charges before the council for fraud and coordinated misappropriation of registered pack land. Vera resigned his council seat before he could be formally censured, which was cowardice of a predictable kind. Vera, who had never in her life faced a consequence she hadn't first managed, found that the machinery she had built was very efficient at concealing wrongdoing and entirely useless at absorbing accountability. The charges were upheld. The Ashford estate was returned in full. Vera was stripped of her countess title, which she had held through her marriage to Nellie's father, and removed from pack standing in the territory. Dorian Ashwell's pack was fined under territorial law and required to formally dissolve the agreement and issue a public retraction. None of it brought Edmund Ashford back. Nellie had never expected it to. Justice and reparation are not the same as repair, and she had understood that distinction long before any of this happened. But there is a specific and necessary relief in watching the world acknowledge what was done, in having the truth made official, and the lies made visible, and the people who arranged them made to stand in the room with what they chose. She stood in that room. She was glad for it. She and Owen returned to Ashford Manor in early winter, when the first frost had settled on the stone walls, and the pine forest beyond the eastern boundary had gone still and silver. The house felt different without Vera's careful management of its atmosphere. Larger somehow, and colder in the good way, the way of a place that has been allowed to breathe again. The staff, who had stayed through everything, moved through the halls with a lightness that told Nellie more about the years of Vera's tenure than any document had. She walked every room. She walked the library last. The doors were fully open this time. Xander came to Ashford twice in those months, on council business that she suspected was not entirely necessary, and did not say so. The second visit lasted 4 days. On the third evening, they walked the pine forest along the eastern boundary in the late afternoon light, the cold air carrying the smell of resin and frozen earth. Their breath visible, the silence between them, the comfortable kind that has been earned. He told her, that evening, what he had known since the night he found her on the forest path. Not in the language of pack bond and moon-blessed destiny, not with the weight of inevitability that she had learned to distrust. He told her simply, in the way he said most things, that she was his mate, that he had known it when mist stopped on the path, and he had walked out of the trees and seen her sitting in the dark with a bleeding arm, and a box pressed to her ribs, and the expression of someone who has lost everything, and is already deciding what to do next. That he had understood, in that moment, something he had not expected to understand. That he had not told her, because she had given him every correct reason not to. That he was telling her now because she deserved to know, and because he intended to let her decide what to do with it, and because he was, under everything, a man who believed that a thing chosen was worth more than a thing simply felt. Nellie stood in the frost-silvered pines and listened, and held the information the way she had learned to hold hard things, with both hands, and without flinching. She thought about Dorian's hands, counting against his knee. She thought about the word suitable, and the library doors, and the night road, and the tin cup, and the wool blanket that smelled of cedar. She thought about 3 days in a carriage with a man who had given her the room to speak, and then told her she had done it herself. She thought about her father, who had taught her to watch hands and notice things, and saddle a horse in the dark if she had to. She thought the bond had not made her feel what she felt. She had built it herself, slowly, from evidence. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was deciding." "And?" She turned to face him in the silver light, her father's ring warm on her hand, and the forest quiet around them, and the house visible through the trees with its windows lit against the early dark. "I've decided," she said. He did not reach for her immediately. He was, she had learned, a man who waited for invitation and then did not hesitate. She gave it, closing the distance between them, and his arms came around her with the same quality she had felt from the beginning, steady, present, not performing anything. They were married in the spring at Ashford Manor, with Owen standing beside her and the pine forest in new leaf beyond the windows, and Xander's guard lined in the courtyard in their formal coats, and the household staff crowded at the back of the great hall, where Vera had once arranged futures without consulting anyone. No one arranged this one. Nellie arranged it herself, precisely the way she wanted it. She wore her mother's lace at the collar and her father's ring on her hand, and she walked the length of the hall under her own power and stood in front of the man who had walked out of the dark and stayed. And she said the words she had chosen because she meant them, not because a document required them. Xander said his with his gray eyes on her face and his hands still, and his voice carrying through the hall without effort, in the way of a man who has never needed the room to be quiet and has learned to appreciate it when it is. Owen cried, which he denied afterward, and no one believed. They lived in both places, Ashford and Xander's seat at Varenhold, moving with the seasons and the demands of governance, the territories administered with the combined attention of two people who understood, each in their own way, what it costs to have something taken, and what it means to hold it responsibly. The Ashford pack recovered under Owen's stewardship. The land that Edmund had built came back to itself slowly, the way things do when the right people are finally paying attention. Nellie took her place in council work, not by assignment, not by courtesy of her husband's title, but by petition, on the strength of her own legal standing as a registered pack heir, approved by Lord Fenwick, who wrote her a letter afterward that was 4 sentences long and constituted, from him, something close to effusive praise. She kept the letter. She kept everything worth keeping. Years later, when the story of how she had come to be where she was occasionally surfaced in the way that stories do, she never began it with the council chamber or the verdict or the spring wedding. She began it with the library doors, with the amber light on the floor and the voices, and the moment she understood that the ground she had been standing on was not what she had believed it to be, because that was the true beginning. Not the loss. The decision made immediately after it. The carved box sat on the mantel in her study at Ashford, between 2 candles, open. The ring was on her hand. The deed was framed on the wall behind her desk, the burgundy wax seal intact, her father's signature across the bottom in the strong, unhurried hand of a man who had believed rightly that what he built would last. It had lasted. She had made sure of it. Outside, the pine forest ran to the boundary wall and beyond, silver in winter and deep green in summer, the way it had always been, the way it would continue to be. The ground was still. It would hold.